I have now finished transcribing the Greek text of the Seven Ecumenical Councils into a Google Doc, and I released the text to the public domain. I did the same thing with the 4 great creeds of the Christian faith. Links to these are on my sources page. The creeds were a lot easier than the councils. Public domain text versions of them already exist on the web, and I just needed to pull a few together and make the right text or pick a text that was mostly reliable and in the public domain. I'm also releasing a Greek/English diglot of the 7 Ecumenical Councils on Amazon using public domain English translations. The 4 great creeds are too short to do this as a book, so I'm going to release them as posters with the original language on top and the English translation on the bottom. This is a part of my ongoing Corrected King James project. Last week, I talked about why I think the canon is open and the rules I'm working with as I try to find the inspired words of God that have come to men since the 2nd century. Undoubtedly, my technique will need refinement. I've always been skeptical of the concept of a closed canon, at least in theory. Having family that was Mormon when I was young, the question naturally came up, why isn't the Book of Mormon canon outside Mormonism? I have my reasons for excluding the Book of Mormon specifically, but that raises more questions. Not all books are written by known failed prophets, or have restricted their influence to a single sect. So could the words of God come to another? How would we know if they had? What about those other books of the Old Testament seen in other denominations? For a long time as a young adult, I was content to consider the theory of an open canon without actually adding any text to my Bible. I stuck with the 66-book Bible of the Protestants, because I'm a Protestant, and I mostly attend Protestant churches and it makes for shorter conversations when we all agree. I'd rather be right than follow the crowd, but I wasn't sure what was right and I needed to pick a Bible, so there it was. I've seen lists of quotations by the Church Fathers and how they used the deuterocanonical books, and ultimately came to the conclusion that the arguments to include them were more compelling than the arguments to remove them. I thought that would be my foot in the door, but it led me to a dead end. Not that the signs weren't there to help me see what was going on, but they were dim signs and I wanted a little more certainty than I was getting. It may sound strange, but it was realizing that the 2 letters that are called, from Clement, don't make the cut that made all the difference for me. It's possible that at least one of these letters is older than some of the letters in the Bible. 1 Clement could be older than Revelation or the Gospel of John, for example. Clement the person wasn't further from the apostles than Mark or Luke. There really aren't any problems of doctrine with the 2 letters. So stopping and asking, why didn't these 2 make it into our current Bibles? Was a helpful exercise. The 2 letters attributed to Clement enjoyed a lot of popularity at first, but then slowly fell out of favor. That was the point that made all the difference. The second point that made a difference to me was a line from the 3 Musketeers. When D'Artagnan and Gascon create a false reason for their quarrel, the false reason is a dispute over a passage of Augustine. Looking into the influence Augustine has had in the Church, the results were astounding. Catholics and Lutherans both brought Augustine's insights to the front in their discussions about how to properly do religious life. I was still a little hesitant on the idea of Augustine, but it gave me a lower bound. Something needs this much influence over this kind of time frame. And if Augustine is a maybe by that regard, then at the very least the first 4 ecumenical councils would seem to be a shoo-in. These are so universally accepted that they even managed to get a mention in the poem by Lancelot Andrewes about the bounding documents of the Christian faith. The 7 as a total are seen as authoritative in the Eastern churches, the Roman Catholic Church, and Anglicans. These congregations of congregations will agree on the decisions made in these 7 councils and will use them to bring each other back to center when one of them gets off track. As with anything about the canon, there's a little fuzziness around the edges. In the same way we could argue about whether the ending of Mark or the doxology on the Lord's Prayer in Matthew belong in our Bibles, there's room to argue over Trullo or Nicaea too, and individual line items or canons along the way. For my place in this process, the 7 without Trullo and including Nicaea too tend to come as a set, so that's what I'm doing. I'll let those that come after me clear up those edges, if they can, the same way they'll clear up the edges on Mark's end or the doxology, if they can. When I look at the possibility of expanding my canon, I also find myself wanting to bind my expanded canon into a single volume for easy carrying to and from church. And since I'm looking for the things that have been seen and heard across Christendom for hundreds of years, there are very likely going to be existing Elizabethan English translations of the things I'm choosing. So adding the existing English translations to my corrected King James shouldn't be a problem. For example, the Philip Schaff translations of the Councils and Creeds. I will have to edit and modify it a bit. After all, Schaff includes a lot of in-text notes that wouldn't really be appropriate for devotional reading or study. One of the things that has always bothered me about eccentric one-person translations, like mine will be by definition, is that they very often don't give the resources they use. Pastor Mike Winger has put together a number of passionate, but well-thought-out criticisms of the translation made by Brian Simmons. I haven't read that translation, and so I'm not qualified to offer an opinion on it, but the criticisms I've heard seem valid. Simmons says he uses the Peshitta, but then New Testament scholars tell us there's no reason to trust the Peshitta, and Peshitta scholars tell us that this isn't what the Peshitta says anyway. That's why nothing in my corrected King James Version is a completely independent translation. I'll change the King James text when and only when my source could not be read in a way that's compatible with what the King James Translation Committee agreed to. There are times when the King James Translation Committee pushed the limits of what they had in front of them, but I don't correct them in those cases. For example, Psalm 2 verse 12 starts with Nash Kabar. The King James translators interpret Yubar as the Aramaic word for son, Strong's number 1247, causing them to render these two words as kiss the son. The Jewish Publications Society interpret the same word to be the Hebrew word for purity, Strong's number 1249, causing them to render the same two words as do homage and purity. When I make my own translation of this verse from scratch, I'll have to look into how the words are used in other places and make a decision on which I think is more likely. But in the corrected King James Version, I'm just the last secretary putting my stamp on it before it leaves for the press. I see how they get it from the source, so at worst I'll add a footnote. Probably not even that. There is a point of being careful about calling these things I'm adding scripture, though. I've been wrong before, and I'll be wrong again. And if I'm not, I was just wrong. When I'm discussing matters of faith with people who disagree with me on that point, I want to be clear about my commitments, but also about the fact that they aren't committed. I can't tell for sure, but I get the sense that this kind of distinction has been useful in the past. At one point in the Jewish dialogue, there was a dispute about how much authority to give the prophets. So they separated the Torah and the prophets. Then among those who took the prophets, there was a canon of law and prophets, but there were other writings that people argued over. These became the writings. Between Jews and Christians, the dispute was the New Testament. Between Christians, there was a dispute about which extra writings to include, and those that wanted to stick to the Jewish canon for the Old Testament called the Septuagint editions Apocrypha, and those that wanted it all continued to keep them separate but called them deuterocanonical. I accept them, and I don't care which you call them as long as you personally don't intend it as an insult. I'm not one of those that says just because a term was originally intended as an insult it has to remain so. To that end, I see an element of tradition in keeping the other sets I accept to their own collection with its own name. And it's not just a tradition, it has value as well. The Seven Ecumenical Councils have their own name already. It's the Seven Ecumenical Councils. I don't need to name that. I may have to put more thought into the whole collection that I include when I bind that up. I'm thinking of making the distinction between Sacra Scriptura and Vera Verba, sacred scripture and true words. I welcome commentary on the Latin, since it's not a language I study. But that's just because I like alliteration. This was a suggestion by a friend, but it was originally given humorously, so I don't think that they would be offended if a better idea came up. At the end of this year, I'm going to finish up the second edition of my corrected King James. In this, I will start by making an updated Elizabethan English New Testament that follows the Robinson-Pierpont majority text. This text will be made by using the King James Version, the American Standard Version, and then Dr. Robinson's notes on the differences between his text and the other Greek editions. I will release this majority text-based New Testament to the public domain, and use that for the books of the New Testament where I prefer the Greek. In the printed version, I will include footnotes about differences between various Greek editions and a few other standard versions. In the Old Testament, I will only make the attempt to correct chapter and verse divisions where they are not the same as the Leningrad Codex or Septuagint in the Deuterocanonical books. There will be no footnotes added to the Old Testament or Paul's letters in the second edition of the corrected King James Version. Perhaps the third, God willing. I will replace all of the existing corrected King James versions for sale on Amazon. But I will hope to add a corrected King James Open Canon edition. That will include my expanded canon and a corrected King James source version that will have my preferred sources for every book of the Bible, but no English translation. While I finish getting all of this together, please enjoy the 7 Ecumenical Councils in Greek. I've enabled commenting on the Google Doc, so if you find a typo, I'd appreciate a heads up. If you just want to read and enjoy, or need them for your own project, that's why they're being released to the public domain.